Chapter 1. They'd already been out of dock for a few weeks when they got the call. A mining outpost, 3 days away. 31 technicians trapped in the infested area, completely out of contact for over 80 hours. Deep 4 was populated by a few hundred machine techs and some low-level management. A company outpost like 100 others. This one melted dirt to get to Silurium. Whatever the hell that was. Martin Jess didn't particularly give a shit, truth be known. He and his boys weren't called in to give a rat's ass about minerals, or miners for that matter. What mattered was that they were now 20 minutes out, probably no more than an hour till party time, which meant it was time to suit up. Jess took a final swig of coffee and tossed the cup into the recycler on his way out of the mess, gritting his teeth slightly as he walked beneath the cheaply framed doorway. Although he couldn't hear it, he knew that a soft mechanical beep went off in ops as he passed beneath the frame, recording codes from his surgical implant. He sighed inwardly as he headed down the dim and sweaty B corridor, toward lockers. It still bothered him, even after all this time. One of the many annoying consequences of a felony conviction, he supposed. Even the Corps wouldn't take chances on their leased volunteer ships. If any of their little birdies wanted to fly away, or, say, slit the captain's throat during a psychotic episode, these ships were set up to know all the gory details. Expensive in terms of equipment, but not as bad as trying to hire civilians for this sort of work. The open comm interrupted his wanderings. "Jess, this is Pop. Tell the boys we're looking at 15 minutes till break. I wouldn't want Pulaski to choke to death on his sugar rush or anything." Jess spoke as he walked, grinning. "It's going to take more than a candy bar to kill the man." Commander Pop Izzard chuckled gruffly, sounding muffled through the ship's aging communication system. "I hear that. Keep an ear up for the count. I'll leave shipwide on." Standard procedure. Jess didn't bother answering as he hung a left towards the unloading ramp, down a much shorter hallway, but as poorly lit and ventilated as the last. Even with the Max aboard, HK teams didn't warrant the best of ships, though the Nemesis wasn't the worst he'd experienced. Not a luxury liner, but one of his first stints had been on a real shithole, a poured plastic job, the Exeter. This was before some genius got the idea to capitalize on team spirit by naming the newer breed of HK cruisers shit like Enmity and Wrath. Hell, compared to the Exeter, the Nemesis was a wet dream. At least there was room to stretch here without putting your fist in somebody's face. He stopped in front of the suit-up area, took a deep breath. When this one was finished, they'd be headed for a full week of R&R, their first real break in months. Most stops were overnighters, supply pickups or transfers. They could all use the rest. In spite of himself, he could already feel the adrenaline starting to tingle through his veins, singing to the glories of the hunt. Apparently his body wasn't hip to how crazy stupid all of this was. Not that it ever had been. A couple of years ago, he couldn't wait for the feel of a hot pulse rifle in his hands, set against the hissing shrieks of the enemy. A few years before that, smuggling and gangbanging were his drugs of choice. Anything that spelled trouble and a chance to fuck with death. Oh yeah, he'd been a hard ass once. Now? Now he watched the time, marking out the months he had left until parole. The skin over his implant was itching lately, and he wanted it gone. 8 more after this, and time served. Starting now, numbnuts. You have a crew to lead, and they're both looking to you to keep them alive. You gonna do that? Or are you gonna stand here tripping all day in the fucking hall? "Hail Mary," he mumbled, and tapped the entry keypad. Second Lieutenant Catherine Lara ran her hands across the keys and sent the first in a series of hailers to Treon, Deep 4 specifically. She barely had to think about it anymore, practically muscle memory. Weyland-Yutani cruiser Nemesis, HK Berserker team inbound, ETA blah blah blah, frequencies and codes and stats, data entry at its most basic. She was suffused with a bizarre combination of emotional tension and physical lethargy. Her shoulders ached. This wasn't what she'd had in mind throughout her long, often psychotically paced training, the joy of punching code and running communications for a corporate lease ship. The cause was valid, sure, but lately she was hard-pressed to rationalize the methods. Teep, for example. I'm late for a most important date, Teep sang softly, his low voice broadcasting clearly through the small cockpit. Speak of the devil. Lara smiled vaguely, but could hear the strain in his voice, the carefully checked fear. Behind her, Pop laughed. Lara glanced up at a one-way monitor and quickly looked back at her computer screen. Teep and Jess were tightening their armor already, but Pulaski was still padding around in his jock, simultaneously chewing on a Mars bar and unself-consciously scratching one huge and tightly muscled buttock. The Candyman was a testosterone dork, almost a giant without even the obvious years of bodybuilding and steroids. Big-time macho right down to the buzzed white mohawk and a tattoo of a snake on his arm. Not someone she particularly wanted to watch scratching his butt. Let Pop keep an eye on things for a while. You want to light a fire down there, Pulaski? Pop had apparently been doing just that. Lara glanced over her shoulder. He was already focused back on the controls, piloting easily towards Treyon. Light this, said Pulaski, and laughed loudly. Lara didn't bother to look up at this time. She could guess what he was holding beside the perpetual candy bar. A list of stats and a form letter acknowledgement scrolled up in front of her as Deep 4 picked up its channel of choice. She punched in the return formalities and logged a few numbers, trying to tune out some of the tense laughter that pulsed over the intercom as the boys got themselves geared. This was her 7th run on the Nemesis with Pop, their 5th with this particular threesome. Well, except for Teep's predecessor, Manning's. That Weasley little creep had finally burned out 4 missions back. None of the volunteers were in for sex crimes, company precautions and morale and all that, but she'd suspected that Manning's had slipped through anyway. The way he'd watched her every time she moved. Lara shuddered slightly. Even now, she couldn't muster any pity for him, although he'd psyched out hard, maybe 1 mission away from a full psychotic break. A solemn male voice interrupted her thoughts. This is Treyon, Weyland-Yutani, Deep 4, hailing Nemesis, over. Lara tapped her mic. Treyon, Deep 4, you got hunter-killer Nemesis on an inward bounder, requesting landing coordinates. We are at... She glanced down at her monitor. 101-37, headed 100-26, over. A string of numbers flitted across the screen, and when the communications tech spoke again, she could hear exhaustion and relief in his voice. Can't tell you how glad we are to see a Berserker team, Nemesis. Coordinates sent and LZ is clear. Supervisor Sturgis will come across, over. Received, over and out. Lara punched a few more buttons and then stretched her arms back, duties performed for the moment. Jess and Pulaski were laughing over something, and she warily looked up at the locker vid. Pulaski had pants on at least. They were a pretty good group, all in all, a cut above what she'd come to expect. Martin Jess was straddling one end of the locker room bench, grinning easily. Tall, brown-skinned, and with a winning laugh and some military experience, he was a solid ground leader. One of those calming crisis types who excelled in keeping up team spirit. Although not particularly well educated, he was sharp and alert in his work. High intelligence marks for his parole distributor. Jess looked up at the cam, still grinning. Hey Pop, you hear that? Teep wants to know how come they can't train a dog to do his job. Pulaski cut in. And he told him because they can't find a dog dumb enough to volunteer. Teep smiled tightly, his thin, pale face outlined by a dark scruff of beard. The cuff of his right ear was pierced with thick steel hoops, his spiky hair pushed back over shaved sides. Teep was the youngest member of the team. Yeah, you're a real funny guy, Jess. I'll lie awake nights and laugh about that one. My life has meaning now. Lara could tell he was sweating, in spite of the cool temperature in the locker room. Pulaski was finally struggling into his armor, the legend, Eat Me, scrawled across one massive shoulder guard. Well, I ain't dumb, and I volunteered. Teep and Jess exchanged a smirking glance, and Teep sighed. Borderline psychotics don't count, Candyman, since their intelligence isn't called into play over decisions like HK sign-up. It'll be reflexive. Jess cracked up. Teep played it straight as usual. He was probably the wittiest of the three, which was good. Lara had theorized that the betas with decent senses of humor did better than those without. Hell, look at Manning's. Hysterics, shakes, the whole read of symptoms. And his taste had run toward frighteningly malicious pussy jokes. Teep held it together pretty well, all things considered. I don't remember no mention of the word borderline, Pulaski said, then laughed boredly. He picked up an M41 and pumped the action on the grenade launcher, the well-oiled metal snapping sharply. Pop spoke up behind her, sounding amused. That's what I like, a happy crew. I'm going to miss you little rays of sunshine when I'm gone. Pop couldn't see her expression. Lara smiled, slightly. She couldn't speak for the team, but she didn't expect to miss Eric Pop Izzard very much at all, in spite of whatever he thought. And speaking of, how's Max, Ellis? Lara tuned back in. Max was fine, or they'd have heard about it, but she wondered how their newest addition was holding up. Ellis seemed like a nice kid, shy, straggling with some of the same career choices as her. They talked a few times over coffee about assignments, and she'd filled him in on a few tidbits of HK etiquette while they swapped info on Max. He was as interested in the SOP as she was about the robotics. Ellis's soft, clear voice filled the room. Still in deep sedation, sir. Respiratory and cardio rate even. No REMs. You want me to run a full systems check, Commander? Lara winced slightly, and Pop's icily bland reply spoke volumes. That would be helpful, son. We may be needing him soon. He calmed off sharply and scoffed. 26 missions, and they saddle me with Ellis. What does the guy do all day? Lara shrugged, but didn't turn around. He's green, but he's got the training. Give him a chance. Pop laughed softly, and she could tell he was shaking his head gently, as if to say, yeah, whatever, babe. He raised his voice suddenly, his standard go-get-em tone at full volume, and he addressed the team. We're there in 5. Belt up, boot up, and get ready to roll, people. God, he was starting to annoy her. Sleeping with him had been a serious mistake.